What's going on, guys? We are back for another installment of the Little Leg series where I teach you how to build bigger and stronger legs. We're on the quest of bigger quads and bigger hamstrings. Today we are in Hatfield, Pennsylvania at my friend Joey Szatmary's gym, Lions Den Elite Training. Joey's gonna share some of his favorite tips for building stronger and more aesthetic legs. More specifically, we're gonna talk about hypertrophy for the legs. But before we dive into those tips, we'd love to have a little intro from yourself, Joey, for anybody who has never seen you.
What's up, guys? People call me Coach Joe, Joey Szatmary, and right now I'm actually really strong in strongman, no pun intended, but that's kind of my sport of choice. I am the USS heavyweight national champion, which is pretty cool. But before I got into strongman, I love just doing strength training in general. I dabbled in Olympic weightlifting, where I totaled around 350 kilos between the clean jerk and the snatch. I did CrossFit for a while, and then I was an athlete pretty much my whole life. But my primary passion is just strength and conditioning. I love getting people strong. I love increasing the size of my muscle and other people's muscle. So this is a fun video for me, and I just want to say thanks for having me on the channel, dude, but let's dive into it, bro.
Of course, and if you cannot tell, and if that resume wasn't impressive enough, Joey knows a thing about legs, and especially leg training, and I know you're in a hypertrophy block right now, so let's dive into the first tip. When it comes to hypertrophy training for legs specifically, what's your go-to favorite thing to help others understand in the quest of building bigger legs?
Yeah, so I would say for tip number one, it's kind of outside of quads and hamstrings, which we will talk about, but you have to understand these principles before we get into the quads and hamstrings. And that's just basic tips in terms of frequency. So when it comes to leg training, I'm a fan of higher frequency. So definitely more than one time per week. I would say anywhere from the 2 to 3, sometimes people train up to 5 times per week with your legs. And honestly, it can be done if you do it correctly. But I think if you make the mistake of just training once per week, you're just limiting yourself. So increasing that frequency is gonna be huge for me. Another training principle is just gonna be progressive overload. Obviously, to get stronger and increase the muscle size, we have to constantly be pushing ourselves more and more. So having that principle in your programming is gonna be your best friend. And the last one's gonna be higher volume. So when it comes to hypertrophy training, and like you had said, I've been doing tons of hypertrophy training. The volume was a lot higher than if I was in a strength block. And the whole point of hypertrophy is to increase the muscle size. So right off the bat, those are gonna be big principles. The other ones that I'll kind of have as like sub-principles, it's just gonna be full ROM, so full range of motion with every exercise that we're doing. I don't see any point of why you wouldn't get full range of motion when you're doing these exercises, especially if we're trying to increase the muscle as a whole. We want to get the biggest stretch that we're allowed to get possible to have it grow as efficient as possible. And then the other one, it's just a small little one, but just controlling the eccentric. I think a lot of people don't focus on that enough. And it doesn't have to be a tempo by any means, but just being cognizant and aware throughout the eccentric portion of the movement, because I think there's a lot of growth that can happen in that movement or portion of the movement. And those would kind of be like my biggest tips for tip number one.
Yeah, and you bring up a lot of great points that I think a lot of folks overlook. For example, just having a consistent flow to your exercises, right? Like you don't need a tempo per se, but having some consistent lowering pattern. Like you gotta think, if you're doing 12 reps and you have a consistent flow versus just letting that crash, how many accumulated minutes is that a week of additional training load? So that is a great tip, and hopefully everyone out there can conceptualize it and start implementing some of those bits and pieces within that tip in their training. But now let's dive into tip 2, which we discussed was focused on the quads.
Yeah.
So what is your favorite quad / hypertrophy / aesthetic tip?
Yeah, so trying to piggyback off of everything we said, apply all those principles to what I'm about to say. But even like Jake and I were kind of talking about how everyone thinks that we have to squat all the time to get really good looking legs. And although I do love the squat and I think you should incorporate squats as much as possible, I think there are other alternatives. So for me, one of my favorite alternatives to growing my legs as big as possible are other variations such as like hack squats, doing belt squats. And the thing that's cool about them is we're definitely targeting the quads, but we also are limiting our systemic fatigue. So when we do a heavy barbell squat, that's gonna be a lot more taxing on our body versus doing something like a hack squat or a belt squat. So it's gonna allow us to train that movement more by not allowing us to accumulate tons of systemic fatigue. And that's gonna be one of my kind of favorite primary quad things would be doing the hack squats, those other variations. And then on top of that, maybe adding some sort of tempo in there. I think adding a tempo to anything is really gonna push growth because you're gonna be burning that muscle up like crazy. And that's gonna be something that I always incorporate at least to one of those exercises throughout the week is gonna have a tempo, just slow it down, focus on that mind-muscle connection, getting that full range of motion like we had talked about earlier. But those are kind of going to be like my primary ones. And then the last one I'll have in the subcategory of the quads is going to be playing with different angles of the toes and the feet. So sometimes when I'm doing squat variations or hack squats, I'll maybe go a little bit wider. Sometimes I'll go more narrow. The other thing I was talking about with Jake is letting my knees track more forward to really hit those quads. And I know that's probably gonna make people a little bit hurt or be like, what is this guy talking about? Trust me, you're gonna survive. And if not, gradually get your way there. But I noticed that I'm really putting more emphasis on my quads when I allow those knees to travel a little bit more forward and kind of experience a little bit different plane of motion.
Yeah, I love that tip, honestly, and all of those tips, because I think, like you said, we get married to the idea of you have to back squat to build great legs. And again, there are so many great variations out there. And if somebody can't get into a full range of motion squat, it's actually probably more limiting to continue forcing that load and that body pattern versus using a variation that works. Maybe some anterior loading, maybe the hack squat machine, maybe the leg press. But now let's dive into tip number 3, which is focused on the posterior portion of the legs, AKA the hamstrings. I think a very underserved muscle group. What are your favorite tips for training hamstrings?
Yeah, so the hamstrings have been something for me that have really grown a lot, probably in the last year. And the first thing I want to say that had helped grow my hamstrings was just increasing the frequency, like we talked about. So it's a muscle group that you can train more frequent throughout the week, but more specifically during this hypertrophy cycle that I've been doing is really focusing on isolation movements. Obviously, if you're a bodybuilder, isolation movements are going to be your best friend. So they've really helped me, and I actually purchased a lying leg curl machine, which I never thought I'd probably have in my gym, but it's been one of the best investments, and I use it multiple times throughout my training blocks, even throughout my training weeks, just to help really attack the muscle group in its entirety. So isolation is going to be king to me when we're trying to really target those hamstrings. Obviously, deadlifts are great, and we want to do compound movements, and you're going to put on good size and mass there. But if we're really trying to focus on the aesthetics, something where we can really isolate like that machine is going to be a really good bang for your buck. Now, outside of that, something I absolutely love are doing RDLs or stiff leg deadlifts. And I love to play with hip positioning, so having my hips pretty high up and really getting my hamstrings to just be as lengthened as possible. And then if we want to step it even further, we can add a deficit to that. So we're just increasing the range of motion even more, really putting tons of tension on the hamstrings. But when it comes to that, like I said, overall, I think the main issue that people struggle with hamstrings is isolation in general, or they start moving their body in a way that is using and recruiting other muscles that are not the hamstrings as the primary focus. So for me, it was more mind muscle connection, find exercises that really target those hamstrings, stick with those, and those have really been some key tips that have helped me explode my hamstrings.
I love that tip too on the RDL, how you talk about hip position, because I know we mentioned this earlier, but a lot of people think they need to sink the hips and load more weight on the RDL. What that's actually doing, and we discussed this a little bit, is that the hamstrings are biarticulate, so they cross over the knee and the hip. And when you shrink those hips down, it's actually limiting that range of motion and stretch of being able to put on them.
For sure.
So I love your points on adding some extra tempo, some eccentric, like focus on consistency there, and then also that deficit. Those are all fantastic, man.
Yeah, and kind of just to piggyback as like a last tip we could say with all of this is when it comes to really trying to get aesthetic, I think a lot of us need to just let go of our ego with how much weight is in the barbell, because a lot of the exercises and the technique that we need to hit the muscle properly, it's going to be very challenging to do, and you're going to have to take that hit on the ego bus and sit in the back and let the technique be king there, because what we're trying to do is isolate that muscle, and we're trying to cause as much tension as possibly and be very efficient with that. And stuff like that I've just really picked up over this last training cycle. Even in all the movements we've been doing, I just took him through a back workout where we did the same thing with rows, a common movement where people put excessive amounts of weight on. But once we made some minor adjustments with our hips and lengthening the lat, we really couldn't put up as much weight as we thought, but man, were we feeling it in our lats. Yeah. So same thing with the hamstring, same thing with the quads. When you're looking for size, man, really just put the ego aside, really focus on the technique, that mind-muscle connection, and isolating with purpose.
Well, dude, thank you so much for the time. Those are fantastic tips, and hopefully you can take out some of the tidbits of knowledge in here. If you want to up your frequency, try to check your ego at the door and not get married to any one movement, and get creative with your training, as Joey pretty much alluded to and mentioned throughout this video. But dude, thank you so much for the time. If you don't mind, can you drop some plugs to where we can find you? I'm going to drop those down below, but Joey will obviously give you the 401 right here.
For sure. My OnlyFans account? No, I'm just kidding. No OnlyFans account. But if you guys want, check me out on YouTube, Szatstrength, SZAT, then the word strength. It's the same for my Instagram. The gym's Instagram is Lions Den Elite Training. So if you're ever in the Hatfield, Montco area, come check out the gym. We love having new members. We're just a great community of people. And then if you want more content, articles, that kind of formatted stuff, we have Szatstrength.net. Which is the hub for all of that great community. And then we have a Facebook page I always forget to mention, but it's called The Iron Lions. You can request to be in that. Just tons of free content, more articles. We do free reviews of all your lifts and give you guys feedback. So it's just a hub for people to go and check that out. But that's pretty much all I got. If you're watching this man stuff, you're in good hands. So I'm excited to see the growth of the channel, but thanks for having me on, dude.
Thank you. And again, our OnlyFans is 2 dudes and 3 dogs. See you later.